let's go ahead and get started. Just a reminder for a little bit of housekeeping stuff, please make sure you mute yourself. You can also turn off your video if you prefer. When we get to the end, we will open up the floor to everybody who wants to answer questions. If you have a question that you feel like needs to be urgently asked right now, go ahead and type it in the chat, and I will interrupt or try and find a good spot when we can put that question in for Dr. Carle and Dr. Benedetti. And then Dr. Carle and Dr. Benedetti, if you need me to do anything, feel free to stop and ask, and I am happy to do that. So,
you can bail us out if we get caught somewhere.
Okay.
Too academic.
So if you get a little too crazy, I'll
you get too academic,
crazy, yeah. I'll ask you to move along.
Yeah.
I don't think that's likely, but no worries. And then I will also keep track of time for us as well, just in case that becomes an issue. Our plan is to ask about a half an hour worth of questions and then ask our guest questions and then finish up if there are any other additional questions.
Yeah, it's about an hour, I think, right?
Yep, that's what we're going for, is about an hour. And although it's glorious outside, so.
Yes.
It's a great day, spring in California. All right, so having said that, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I would like to say thank you to everybody for, I have to move my windows around a little bit here. I would like to welcome everybody to our first Il Discorso, and I'd like to introduce our host, the Dr. Bob in the Dr. Bob and Friends. He is a professor emeritus in political science from UOP. He's one of our founding members of the Pacific Italian Alliance. He's the one that always reminds us that there's more to Italy than food. And he is a research associate at the Center for California Studies in Sacramento. He's been chair of Cal Humanities and the State Humanities Council. So he's a pretty interesting guy, a Renaissance man, so to speak. And having said that, Dr. Bob, I'll let you go ahead and introduce Dr. Carle. And I will stop sharing my screen, so that way.
I'm happy to do that. The idea of these programs is for us to have a conversation. I have provided some questions for Dr. Carle that she has reviewed, and she will go through them and then open it to the audience. So be saving up your questions. We'll take them at the end. Barbara Carle is a professor of Italian at California State University, Sacramento. She has taught there since 2003. She has academic degrees, including her doctorate from Columbia University in New York City. Dr. Carle is a poet, literary critic, and translator, as well as a scholar of Italian literature, including Dante. She has lectured widely in the United States and Europe, including Italy. She has agreed to discuss a wide range of topics today with us, including the 700th anniversary of Dante's death, her life as a poet, her perceptions of Italian culture today, and she also will read at least a little of her poetry, probably both in Italian and English for those of us who are not able to handle the Italian as we would like. And so let me get started. Let me again, thank Dr. Carle for making this time available so that we can share her knowledge of Italy, a place that we all would like to be more than we are, and she does go back regularly. You were raised, Dr. Carle, by a diplomatic family and exposed to many languages. Why did you select Italian to pursue and make your career? I think you were born in Bangladesh, if I'm not mistaken.
I was born in thank you, first of all, for having me. Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here and know a little more about the Pacific Italian Alliance. Yes, I was born in a diplomatic family in Peshawar, Pakistan. Where
Pakistan, sorry. Next door. Yeah. Actually, it was probably all Pakistan at that time, but yeah.
It was. At that time, it wasn't separated yet. Yes.
Right.
Yes, that's true. So I was definitely traveling in a lot of countries, Pakistan, then later Bangladesh when there was the war, and obviously India, North Africa, Thailand, Iran, South America as well. And when I was 16, almost 17, my father was sent to Libya, to Tripoli. And there weren't any schools there because of the situation at the time with Gaddafi. And so he sent me, how terrible, to boarding school in Rome.
Ah,
And basically, that's what decided everything, really. Just it was a sort of I clicked, fell in love at first sound with Italian, with the language, definitely, and that decided really everything I did after that.
well, that's wonderful. Very interesting. Uh, Let me jump into something that I think all of us feel we should be doing, but not all of us do, which is read Dante. Dante is the book for Italians. Why do you think someone these days should read Dante? He came from a very different world, a really pre-Renaissance world, a high Middle Age world, which is very different than ours. Why should we pick up the book?
Well, thank you for that question. We're now celebrating the 700th anniversary of Dante's death in September of 1321. And in Italy, 2 days ago, was Dante Di, which is the new Dante Day that was decided last year. And there were all types of events, conferences, readings, just so many that I would need a class to tell you all about them. I myself was involved in some of them, but it's definitely a very important aspect of Italian culture, Dante. But there are 1,000 reasons I could give you, so I'm going to try and give you just one or two. So I'll begin by saying that what I tell my students is that great books give you what you need. And the Divine Comedy, which is one of Dante's works, in my opinion, does that. So I just want to quote Terzina of Dante, and I'll comment it, which is from Canto 26 of D'Inferno. Considerate la vostra semenza. Fatti non foste a viver come bruti, ma a seguir virtute e conoscenza. So consider your origins. You were not made to live as brutes, but to seek virtue, goodness, and knowledge. So this is one reason. We were not made to live like brutes, okay? If we all followed the goal of virtue and goodness and knowledge, the world would definitely be a better place. And I often dream that all politicians read Dante. They would behave differently if they did. So I could also call the Divine Comedy a sort of user's manual on how to live. Because it has that as well. That said, it has, as all great poetry, it contains everything, and it can be approached from all sorts of different points of view. It can be approached from a Christian point of view, but from a non-Christian point of view as well, historically, politically, from a literary point of view, from a linguistic point of view, which is perhaps one of the most fascinating, from a theological point of view, etc. And this brings us back to my main point, that a great work gives you what you need.
Very persuasive. Let me ask, if one was to start deciding that this was a good thing and we ought to go ahead and read the Divine Comedy, is there anything we should do before we pick it up? Any historical information or anything we should have? And how do we decide? There are 100,000 translations. Many of them give the Italian and English. How do we decide which translation and whether there's anything we should use as a prep before we plunge in?
Well, there's no doubt that to read Dante, there are historical references and political references and theological references that he makes that are useful to know. That doesn't mean that you have to necessarily be a medieval historian, but it does help if you know the context of medieval Italy and Europe, where in Italy especially there was a struggle between the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor. And of course, the city-states were involved in that struggle, sometimes supported by the Pope, sometimes supported by the Emperor, but there was this tension. Of course, the city of Florence, being a rather powerful city-state, was very much a protagonist in all of that. So Dante was on the front lines of that situation, being one of the sort of mayors of Florence. He was a priore, he was on the city council. So you have to know that he had personal relations with the Pope, who detained him in Rome, and so he could go and enter Florence, etc., and support his faction, let's say. So Dante makes a lot of references to the history of his time. So it helps to know about this and a bit of Roman history. And obviously, if you know something of Virgil and you know who is St. Augustine and you know some of these things, that definitely helps. But you can also just decide to plunge in, and there are many excellent editions with notes. The Italian that we read in Dante is the Italian, okay, it's somewhat distant, but it still is the Italian we read today. The beginning is the language we can all understand and recognize. So that's definitely something which is, the Italian we speak comes from that. Recently, all of Italy is in arms because a German paper in Frankfurt attacked Dante and made a series of statements and said Shakespeare was better, etc., etc. This has created a huge a lot of reactions. It's a very odd thing, but anyway, the Italian literary tradition that is in the West is one of the longest ones. And I have a sinologist here, and of course we know he'll tell you that the Chinese literary tradition is the longest uninterrupted one in the world, which is true, obviously. But in the West, the Italian is one of the longest uninterrupted literary traditions because it begins around 1300, okay, with Dante, but even before that, you have poets writing, even before. So I mean that's one of the historical background does help to have some of it, but you don't have to be a specialist. Okay, the question of translations is a pretty complex one because Dante was first translated in Latin, then in Catalan, and then in Spanish in the 15th and 16th centuries. Those were the earliest translations, and much later in English. The first English translations were in the early 1800s, and the first American translation, of course, is Longfellow in the mid to late 1800s. So we have hundreds of years of translations of Dante. So that is it's a huge subject. I tend to prefer to read the original, but my students need to read the English to dive into the original, okay, because it is complex. I can share with you some websites briefly if you want to see, have an idea of what are the most interesting sites. At Columbia, I read him in Italian and then also in Singleton, which is prose, and Sayers, also Hollander. These are some of the well-known translations, and I've read the French translation of Dante as well, but I always return to the original. So, but if you like, just to give you an idea, if I share my screen, I can show you one or two things, on this question. Is that okay?
That's fine.
That is great. You should be able to do that.
Okay, great.
Let me know if you have any challenges.
Yes. Okay. Okay, so what I'd like to show you first is the Columbia website. It's called Digital Dante. You can access it from my webpage if you follow the links. But if you look up Digital Dante, you should get it. And you have many things. You have the commentary by Teodolinda Barolini, who is an Italian-American specialist of Dante, one of the most, actually I can say prestigious. And you have her commentary. And then you have the text in Italian and two translations, Mandelbaum, which is more recent, and Longfellow. And you also have a gallery of images, a video of some of her classes, and audio recordings. So you can, start right away and have a look there, which I like this. The other website, of course, is the Princeton Dante website. That one is run by John Hollander. That is excellent for the notes, and it has all the Divine Comedy in Italian and in English, and it has audio as well. Okay, so you can find that. But on the question also of translations, I wanted to share an article that I was looking at recently, thinking about translation, by a professor who is now emeritus from the University of Virginia, titled Dante's Infernal Heart and the Art of Translation. And he follows one line from Canto 21 of the Inferno, because let's remember that the Divine Comedy is also a comedy, a dark comedy in places, but a comedy. So he takes one line and he looks at all the translations of it, including Botticelli's visual rendition, because the famous painter Botticelli did some drawings from this canto. And here you have these devils who are almost like caricatures, and there's a group of them. They're headed by Malacoda, who is evil tail, and then Barbariccia, who is the head of the 10, and they're supposed to guide Dante and Virgil, and they have these fantastical names. And then at the end, of course, you have this obscene signal that the head devil gives to depart, which is the line that he's looking at, all the versions of this single line, okay? And this is the images here of Botticelli's rendition here, okay? I don't know if you guys can see it well. This one got turned over. Can you guys see this? Is it visible for you?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's because here. But this article, for example, is one that you can find. Here are the devils, okay, and Dante and Virgil, and then this is the signal which Dante describes, okay. The trumpet of paradise here is parodied, it's made fun of, okay, and the signal is, he says, egli aveva del cul fatto trombetta, and he made a trumpet of his ass, literally translated. So he goes through all the different translations of this through time. Okay, so Dante's language, of course, is high and low. Okay, so you have everything. It just gives you an idea.
Very good. Well, obviously, we have a lot to choose from, and I might mention you mentioned Dorothy Sayers was the first translation that I got in college, and she's also the mystery writer. So I was introduced to Lord Peter Wimsey at the same time I met Dante, which I thought was fun. Let me move on from Dante a little bit and talk about one of the other hats you have. You write poetry in both English and Italian. What do you see as the strengths and weaknesses of writing in one language versus the other? You often do it in both. You write one and then you translate it. And I'm not sure which way you go, but what do you see as the strengths and weaknesses of each one of those languages in terms of expressing your poetic imagination?
Can I interrupt for just a second?
Sure.
Somebody asked a great question that might tie in with this as well. Understanding that you also speak French, and have you done translations in French as well? So
yes, a little bit. Yes, it's my maternal language, French. Yes, it's definitely it's always there. It's it's always a subcurrent. It's the first language, but I studied Italian more, probably. Well, maybe, yes, definitely more than French, and I'm an Italianist, so I was trained as an Italianist. But I speak French at home, and I speak French to my husband and my son. So it's definitely always present.
And I noticed that one of the books that you sent me, though there's only one poem, is in French. In fact, the little book is trilingual. There's Italian, French, and English.
Gatizia, yes.
So
Yes.
why do you?
I like it, yes. I mean the way you're doing it.
Somebody's got something on. Okay, there we go. So how do you decide which one of the languages you're going to use to write the poem initially, whatever you do later in translating?
This is a process, it's a trajectory through time. I think that I've ended up writing more in Italian than in English. And that may have to do because French was my first language, but I didn't study it as much. So it seemed that Italian might have sort of filled that one, and I learned it when I was young enough. As I said, it was love at first sound when I was a teenager, and I just dedicated my life really to Italian, to the Italian language. So English and Italian have very different traditions. The English tradition perhaps is younger, the literary tradition. Because when Dante was writing the Divina Commedia, he was writing in a language we still speak today. If I say nel mezzo del cammino nostra vita, most Italians can easily understand that. Okay, it's not some language I don't understand. Whereas you look at Chaucer, who came after Dante, and you try and read the Canterbury Tales, you can't read it. You can't understand. Okay,
yeah,
so
I was going to say, one at April the shirt, the sota is not something that, you got to read it. It's about April, but that's all you get.
It's Middle English, right?
Yeah.
That means that the tradition in English is younger and perhaps more open to innovation, whereas the Italian tradition, because you have Dante and then you have Petrarch and you have Boccaccio, you have the great works right away at the very beginning. So that does add a certain weight, and it means that any poet or anyone writing in Italian has Dante in his DNA. Is impossible not to, and you have to contend with that, which is a huge and a weighty heritage. So that definitely is something that perhaps can be more difficult. But on the other hand, the nature of Italian, being the grandchild of Latin, means that it still retains this incredible flexibility. And it's compact and very flexible, so you can move parts of a sentence around and play with that more. Whereas perhaps English was like that in the past, but it's become, with time, more rigid. And you can't move around parts of a sentence in English as easily. So that's one of the things that I love about Italian, is its flexibility and the way you can play with the syntax of words. And that's one of the reasons why I made this project with my colleague Curtis Smith from classical Chinese to English and Italian, because we were giving different versions and we could move the words around, sometimes to correspond to the classical Chinese in Italian. So that's definitely one of the things I love the most about Italian, among many others. Okay, this is a lifelong passion that is still very strong. So in terms of poems, let me know if you'd like me to read one, perhaps.
Well, let me ask one other question and then go to the poem, because I'm interested in how you select the topics that you write about. One of the things that fascinates me, I think it's the book that's probably most available, Tangible Remains. The poems are about, I guess I would say, simple household items. Balls, books, chairs, glasses, both reading glasses and we drink out of glasses. You seem to be able to take the commonplace, those things we live with, and make them into something, dare I say, heroic. Certainly worth our reflection, where normally I think we just don't think about them. I think you have one on a paperclip. Which is how do you decide that that's what you want to focus on? And you're very clever. In fact, I read through the first time and tried to guess what it was to be sure that and then looked at the back of your book where you tell you what it is, but it's almost like a riddle.
It's a game. It's also
it's a game.
It's definitely a game. In fact, I spoke about this yesterday in my talk at Davis, because this book in the English, there's a new edition now at press. So the original title was Tangible Remains, Toccare quello che resta. Now it's at press, and the new title is Touching What Remains and Toccare quello che resta. So that's 11 years since the first edition. I have been rewriting it extensively in both languages, perhaps more in Italian. But I was inspired by the French poet, you're asking me also, but the French Francis Ponge, when I was in the University of Wisconsin-Madison is where I started this project, so many years ago. And I started reading some of his poems that are on objects, just, any things that surround us. And he expresses this idea that we tend not to pay any attention to things that surround us every day. And so if we just stop and look at them, we see something very different. And so this is the idea that's behind that book. And that's why I removed the titles, because unfortunately people tend to want to project and project certain ideas and expectations on a text. And if you remove the title, that sort of takes away
Crutch.
that crutch, and you tend to look at the object, hopefully discover it slowly. So that's the idea behind the book, and it is something that I've dedicated a good part of my life to, I have to say. Yes. So those are generally shorter poems. The other form, I would say, are sonnets. It's a very Italian form. It's one of my favorite forms, and I've worked a lot on that. And then more recently, longer narrative forms. I recently wrote a poem in terza rima as a homage to Dante, and I just got my copy of the journal today where it came out. So those are, and then also I wrote a longer narrative poem about a California shipwreck. So that's a new thing that I've been doing more recently, the longer narrative poems.
Now, did you want to read one for us?
Read one short one, I thought. Okay, so I'll share the screen so that you guys can follow. So I'll read it, I guess, first in English and then in Italian. Okay, so I'm trying to move this. Okay, can everyone see? Yes, okay. So this is a poem that's not in any volume yet. It was published in two different formats, in a journal and then a sort of literary calendar. And I read this in Puglia, because it's inspired by Puglia, where, of course, you have olive trees that are hundreds, if not sometimes thousands of years old, and they really seem to be like sculptures sometimes. So it's a poem that had a little bit of success, I'll say, in Puglia for that reason, okay? An old man disguised as a rugged king, bizarre to the point of appearing dead, so racked, weather-beaten, and contorted, hunchbacked, wizened, wrinkled, and distorted, uneven, battle-scarred, seasoned, and tough, designed by time's release of swirls and grooves, disjointed, crinkled, deeply furrowed, rough, askew with thorough dissonant strength, inclined to stay beyond the human reign. He still raises his majestic silver mane, reflects on his contemplative wood pillar, sustains the glowing green of olive fruit, solicits the sunlight to boast his truth. And this is Italian. Un vecchio travestito da reale, bizzarro appare, persino morto, tanto è urtato, ammaccato, contorto, increspato, globoso, surreale, grinzoso, battuto, sofferto, eroso, tutto bernoccoli e protuberanze, nodi e macchie, sgualcito e rugoso, ripiegato con strane dissonanze, ricurvo, inclinato radicalmente, ma alza la criniera maestosa, lucente sul tronco contemplativo, storto per essere ultra resistente, mediterraneo, genitore ulivo, l'ultimo nume verde ancora vivo. Okay, so I think that can do for the poems.
Very good. It illustrates a lot of what you've said, and there's a more melodic tone. I mean, singers prefer Italian because of the melodic nature of the language with the open vowels, and that comes through when you read it. It's a much more flowing rendition in Italian than it is in English. And the same words, but different. It hits the ear differently. When you sent me your books, I was really taken by the number of art books that you create, where part of the artistry is the publication of the book. It's illustrated by interesting drawings that someone who cooperates with you does. The paper is wonderful. What has interested you in small batch publishing? Because many of these, in fact, one of them just has a single poem and then some drawings in it. A number of the others, you mentioned the narrative about the shipwreck in Northern California off of the Mendocino coast. That has goes on for 7, 8, 10 pages, but and has these wonderful drawings to go along with it. It really in itself is a work of art. What got you into that?
Well, thank you. That's a difficult question. It's a good question as well. I mean, in Italy, I have some of my dearest friends, and some of them happen to be artists or engravers. And so part of it just happened naturally, just among people that I know and became friends with. In the case of the first collaboration that I did, I had published this long narrative poem in a journal, but I didn't like the way it came out, and so I was looking for a way of publishing it in a more rigorous way. And a friend of mine told me about a Swiss Venetian engraver, artist, and bookmaker, André Beuchat, who works mainly in France, but also in Switzerland and a little bit in Italy. And so he's someone who has a sort of maritime background, being from Venice, and he liked the shipwreck poem, and so he wanted to illustrate. And I shouldn't say illustrate it, because what he does is quite different. But he made these 6 engravings to go along with that, and he makes his own work, and he has antique presses. He does everything himself. He has special paper. So it's really pretty impressive what he does, and I was fortunate to be able to make that book with him. So I preferred that edition. We just did the English. We didn't do the Italian because there is an Italian version of that. But so that's just English. But I was happy about that. So that's one of the reasons I did that. But of course, I am learning a lot about the engraving, because he is really extraordinary. He's won some major prizes in France as well for his engravings. So he's a very interesting character. And then the other person is Luciano Ragozzino. He's an ex-scientist who is then became an engraver, and he turned an ice cream factory into his atelier, his studio in Milano. And he works with a lot of Italy's main writers, I should say. And he's a very, very gracious, very kind person with a good sense of humor. And he's the one with whom I did the book Gattizie, where I have the 3 languages. But in Italy, I should say, art books are pretty common. Okay, there is a tradition it's not such an unusual thing. I think many writers have produced an art book. I guess it's not as common to have engravers like André Beuchat. He's definitely rare, much rarer, and maybe Luciano Ragozzino. There are not that many of them.
Well, in fact, the only time that I've seen that in California was the beat poets in San Francisco dabbled in it, and actually one that's in the valley, Everson brother Antoninus got involved in that a lot. But you're right, we don't see that here as much, and that brings me to some interest in. You must have an interest in art to be interested in doing this. And I think for most people, Italian art is the church, is Baroque and Renaissance, and we really don't know much about what's happening now, or it has happened in the 20th and 21st century in Italy. If you were to educate somebody in terms of more modern after the 19th century, in the 20th and 21st century, where would you go? And are there some artists that you can mention that we really ought to know about, experience, either online or when next time we go to Italy?
Yeah, I mean, I have a passion for art, and I studied it a little bit. I'm not an expert by any means, but it's my passion. I've written a lot about art and poetry as well. But one of the major Italian movements that produced some extraordinary artists, of course, is Futurism.
Yes.
And Futurist Manifesto was published in Paris in 1909. And then you have artists like Boccioni or Giacomo Balla, Carra. You have the painting by Boccioni, The City Rises, which is in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. You can see it there. So there are some extraordinary painters. And then, of course, you have De Chirico. I'm sure you've all heard of De Chirico or Modigliani, and Morandi with his extraordinary still lifes. These are all 20th century artists, extraordinary artists. The best city, I think, in Italy, if you're interested in contemporary and modern art, of course, is Milano, because you have the Museum there of Modern Art, which is right next to the Duomo. It's really an extraordinary place. It has a collection with some of Italy's major 20th century artists like Filippo de Pisis or Mario Sironi or the sculptor Arturo Martini and many, many others. Mario Sironi, for example, is a painter I like a lot. Also, you have the Prada Foundation in Milano, where they hold some amazing exhibitions. And in Torino also, you have some major museums of modern art, and also in Ferrara as well. You think of Ferrara as a Renaissance city, which it is.
Yes.
Even Rome. Rome also has a museum of modern art, which includes the Italian 19th century, the Ottocento, which is also, you have some great artists like Fattorini, De Nittis, who is Italian Impressionist. So it is a very vibrant field.
That brings me to another question. If when this pandemic is over, we're some of us anyway are able to go to Italy, are there any road trips that you would suggest? People often who are interested in art and culture do the Pietro della Francesca trail through Umbria and out that way. But what would you suggest as something if you were able to do anything after this is over? What kind of trail would you follow to sort of surprise yourself, but also greet old friends and neighbors in terms of works of art?
That is a beautiful question, but it's an impossible question.
Okay.
And I'll explain why. Because every corner of Italy has something beautiful. Okay, so I'll give you. I thought a lot about this question. This is a beautiful, beautiful question, but it's a difficult question as well. You could go in many ways. You could, for example, follow Michelangelo in Florence and then to Rome, to give one most people have heard of. Okay, you look at his works in Florence and then you go to Rome, and also Milano, because you have his last work in Milano, which is extraordinary, his Pietà, which is
Yes.
extraordinary work. Or you could simply go to the churches of Venice. And my favorite church in Venice is Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Frari, where you have Titian's and you have Donatello, you have Canova's tomb, you have the tomb of Monteverdi. It's an extraordinary place. I mean, just going there and just being in that basilica is an experience. So you could approach it like that, going to churches. For example, I have a great passion for Leopardi, who was one of Italy's greatest romantic philosophers and poets. He was born in central Italy, in Recanati, and then he lived in Florence, in Pisa, and he ended up in Naples, where his tomb is. So you can, for example, go there in the library in Naples, the Biblioteca Nazionale, they have some of his manuscripts. his final manuscripts. Another trajectory, you can be following someone like Raffaello, who lived in central Italy in various places, okay? And then he ended up in Rome. So you can follow his works. Or Caravaggio. Caravaggio was in Rome and Florence, and he even was in Naples, and then he was briefly in Malta. But he was always getting into fights, Caravaggio.
Yes,
he was always getting into fights with people, and he is getting into trouble. Another trajectory can be music. Through opera, you could go to Rome with Puccini. You could go to Sicily with the Cavalleria Rusticana of Mascagni. And you could go to Venice for Vivaldi's operas, which are less known, which I have a great passion for. Vivaldi's operas are really fantastic. So you could do it that way. But this is a question that I'm sure some of our, for example, we have an art specialist here who is with us, Lorella. She's an art specialist of art history. So she would probably have some ideas on this subject.
Great
maybe we
question.
Maybe we can get to, let me ask one more, and then maybe we can open it up. I have many more here, but let me ask something that's a little bit similar to the art question, but going to writers and now more novelists than poets. There's been a lot made of Elena Ferrante and her books on Naples. Naples is not a city that I know very well. I know it from her and maybe a few other authors. But if I wanted to indulge myself in 20th and 21st century novels from Italy, particularly those that I could read in Italian or in English, where would I go? What would you suggest as a few must reads and why? If say I don't, I leave Ferrante to one side, and other, not that she is worth leaving to one side, but I was trying to get other people.
Well, Elena Ferrante is popular because her book L'Amica Geniale was made into a television series.
Yes. Yeah.
But in Italy,
HBO.
She's not as popular as she is in the United States. She has a very good translator. But my own, that's a huge question as well, a beautiful question, because there are a lot of 20th century and 21st century writers. But some of the ones who have been translated are Italo Calvino. You can find Calvino's works in good translation, good versions. Natalia Ginzburg, she's one of my favorites. She's an extraordinary writer, as well as Elsa Morante. One who I don't know if he's been translated is Giuseppe Pontigia. He died a few years ago. He's based in Milano. Very, very interesting and witty writer, like Natalia Ginzburg. She's very witty as well, but like Calvino as well. He's also extremely humorous. But so those are some of writers, some that I like a lot. Then in terms of contemporary, I also work with a lot of contemporary Italian writers. For example, Rodolfo Di Biasio, his classic novel called I Quattro Camminanti, or Wayfarers 4, was translated into English. And that's about four brothers who leave Italy to go to Rhode Island. And one of them illegally, he was clandestine. He hid a stowaway on a ship. So it's about the story of these four brothers. And in Italy, it's had several versions. It's been republished 3 times. And he goes to schools and talks about this work. But so you have a huge Italian population, by the way, in Rhode Island. And a lot of them are called Di Biasio because they're his relatives. So he's one, but that's getting into the Italian American dimension. And if you guys are interested in that, I would recommend that you go to the Bordighera Press, which is you can just go to bordighera.com, bordigherapress.org actually is what it is. And that is a site especially for Italian American writers. And you have some really interesting ones. I've worked with several of them, as I was saying. Also, Michael Palma he translated Dante's Inferno, and he's working on new translations. He did a verse translation in rhyme of the Inferno, which is really impressive. So it's a very vibrant Italian-American community, and there are a lot of interesting writers.
Good. I think it's about time now to open it up to the people who have sat here and tolerated my questions for 40 minutes or so. And so, Andrea, do we want to have people ask questions, or how do you want to run it?
Absolutely. We can go, if you have a question, go ahead and unmute yourself and you can ask the question. That way we can hear your lovely voice.
And I not only unmute, but so that we can see the video, so that we can see if you're raising your hand.
That would be great. If you don't feel comfortable with that, you can definitely still send me your question in chat. We actually had somebody send one over. I think you kind of hit on it a little bit, but if there's anything that you'd like to add. Are there any other works of literary art aside from Dante that you're as passionate about as you are Dante?
Well, yes. I mean, it's a long list. Okay, I can say that I adore Boccaccio's Decameron. Yes. I love Petrarch's Rime. I like Lorenzo de' Medici's poems. I like Ariosto, his Orlando Furioso, which is a great Renaissance text. I am in love with Leopardi's work. He's the greatest poet and philosopher, one of them. Then we can go on and on. I think that the list is long. I think Italian literature is incredibly rich and has a lot to offer. And then
I was going to say right now, Boccaccio, because of the pandemic, everybody ought to read the Decameron with the pandemic.
Exactly.
And wish we could go up to Settignano and tell stories to each other. But Bill, you had a question.
I have two. What was the name of that press that talks about the Italian-American experience?
If you let me share your screen, I'll show you the link. It's here. It's Bordighera.
Bordighera.
Bordighera press.
Thank you. The other question is, I've never read Dante, but when you talk about all these interpretations, are they stylistic or are they literal about the content?
You mean the translations or the interpretations?
Translations, yeah.
The translations vary enormously. You have, I mean, it's a really vast field. If you look at the early translations in the early 1800s of Carey and Boyd, the British translations, there is an amazing cultural appropriation. They seem to be British works, not Italian works. And with time, that changes. Longfellow's version is actually, I think, quite good and very interesting. But then there are the parts of Dante in the Inferno when he uses low language, as I was suggesting to you earlier, and translators were, a little bit prudish at the beginning at translating some of those words. And it's only in the last 40 years, perhaps, that they actually started translating what Dante wrote, because Dante, it's low to high. So you see that. But it's a very complex tradition, and I would begin probably with translators like Mandelbaum or Longfellow. If you're starting, for example, the Digital Dante, the Columbia website is a really good place to begin.
One other thing I might mention, Barnes and Noble has brought out the Longfellow translations in cheap editions, so you can get the whole Divine Comedy for a few dollars and have it in your hand if that's more comfortable than reading it off a screen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Grazie.
Other questions? We have a lot of people who haven't. I couldn't see because you're still muted and your video is off. Love to see you, so we can see about hands.
That is okay. Bob, do you want to ask another one of your questions while we wait for folks to decide if they have one?
Sure. Let's see here. Italian Americans often learn about Italian culture from films. Are there any recent films you would recommend and why?
Italian cinema is still pretty active, I would say, and there's a lot going on. But I should also tell you right away that I haven't had the chance to see films in the last 2 years, and I don't have to explain to you guys why.
That's true.
Okay. So there are a film that I can begin with that everyone is probably familiar with. I'm sure a lot of you, or maybe you've seen The Great Beauty, La Grande Bellezza by Paolo Sorrentino. It won an Academy Award. It's definitely one of my favorite films. So it came out in the last 10 years. It's a film made in Rome, and it is very satirical, but at the same time, it has a really strong aesthetic sense. Okay, it's very beautiful. It's very beautifully filmed. And then there are some recent films in the last year that came out. One is, I think it's called Non Odiare. It's with the son of Vittorio Gassman, who's a great classic actor, about a doctor who saves someone in a car wreck, and he sees that he has a Nazi, he's a Jewish doctor, and he has a Nazi tattoo on his chest, and then he abandons him. And then he feels this terrible remorse, and he finds his children, and it's a story about that. And then another, which is rather surprising, that came out also in the last year, is called L'Indifferenti, and it's on, it's a literary adaptation of Alberto Moravia, who is a writer who's also been translated quite a bit, who I like quite a lot. So that's a new adaptation of a writer. Interesting. And then another one by a relative. She's Ginevra Elkan. She's from the Agnelli family. They're the ones that own my favorite soccer team, Juventus. Mm-hmm. So she made her first film, and it's about a sort of dysfunctional Italian family. It's very entertaining, but about this sort of typical dysfunctional family, we'll say. Those are the ones that have just come out in the last year, which I have not seen though. Okay, I've read about them, so unfortunately I can't give you like the latest things.
We had some questions come in while you were chatting.
Yes.
Let's see. The first one that we had was, did you have culture shock when you moved here from New York? And why do you teach here in all places?
Yes, well, I went from New York to Madison, Wisconsin, and then to Chicago, and then to Texas, and then I came to California. So I had a lot of culture shocks. But when I lived in Manhattan, I thought it was the center of the world, and I thought I would never leave it. But of course, that's not the way things went, because you really can find so many things in Manhattan. There's no doubt. So yes, of course, California is very different from even Texas. That's a huge culture shock. Or from Chicago is very different also from Madison, Wisconsin. But that's the first place I landed after leaving Manhattan, and it was quite a culture shock.
Let me impose one question from my list that follows up on that. People have some misconceptions about Italians, things they think about Italian culture or Italians themselves. Which ones have you run across that you think are just off the wall, and how do you respond to them when people come up with these things?
Well, there are many. I mean, there are stereotypes from all Italians are dark, okay, and have dark eyes. That's an insane stereotype, because Italy is one of the most diverse ethnically countries that exist, being in the dead center of the Mediterranean. You have really all types of ethnicities. Also an idea that, everyone in Italy eats pasta. Well, no, not everybody does. And in Italy is very diverse. People work very, very hard in Italy. There's this, stereotype about Italians just, drinking whatever red wine and not working. That's also completely ridiculous. But the main thing is that people tend to think that Italy is more, homogenous than it is. and the Italian unification was, recent in compared to other countries, really only concluding in 1870, but starting in 1848, basically. Italy is really different. If you go to Palermo and then you go to Milano, or you go to Trieste, or you go to Bologna, you're going to different planets practically. And they're really deeply different cultural histories and traditions, and that people don't really realize. And because it's mainly mountainous, that's one of the reasons it's harder to get from one place to another, because of the terrain. So it seems like a small country, but you have the Apennines that run down the back, and the Alps in the north. So it means that when you're going from A to B, it's more complex, and that also explains one of the reasons, besides many others, the deep differences in different areas. That's one of them. There are many.
Good.
That is a great question, Bob. We have time for one more, and I'd love to take that one from one of the folks who sent one in chat. Their question is, getting back to Dante, what website or book, or I'm just going to use the word resource, would you recommend to introduce young Americans to Dante? I actually really like this idea. I have a 13-year-old.
There are some video games with Dante. I don't know of all of them, but I can find out, because there's an article I was looking at recently for Dante Day about, it was called Dante Pop, Dante in Popular Culture, and it covered the video games and all the popular sites for younger people for Dante. So I can find that out. I don't have it off the top of my head, because it's not the sort of thing that I use, and because I teach college students, I don't usually use those sites, but I've had students that do, and tell me about some of the video games they play.
I would love that, and we'll go through here and all of the websites that you've talked about as well. I'll go ahead and send out an email to all of our attendees with those resources. Those are really wonderful.
I'm happy to do that. It's a big area, actually, because this article that I was looking at just the other day is a pretty major article on all this other area of Dante, which is the video games, all the different sort of digital area of Dante. But there are also films on Dante. One of the films that I like a lot is by Peter Greenaway. It goes through the first 8 canti. It's an English translation, but I like it quite a bit. And so there are all sorts of things.
Well, thank you very much. Our time is almost up. So I'd like to, on behalf of the Pacific Italian Alliance, thank you both for your time. Thank our guests for their time as well, who have attended. I always love these because I always learn a ton. I have an entire page of notes of things that I've learned to follow up on. So thank you again. It was very, very lovely to have you. And Bob,
thank you for having me.
Let me just say, too, I do hope, Barbara, that you get to Italy this summer and are able to celebrate Dante's 700th anniversary in Italy. And it's been a joy to have you as someone to have dialogue with. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope I can keep your books. I read most of the poems in English, and I was interested in your attempt at a short narrative poem on the breakup of the Northerner right off of Mendocino. Fascinating, and you do a very good job of getting kind of a almost ghostly quality in places, but you follow the facts very closely. I checked on the websites, and
I did a lot of research. I went to the site of the shipwreck as well. I did a lot of work on that.
Are the crosses still there?
Yes. Well, they were when I went, maybe 7-8 years ago. Yeah, they were slipping down the hill, but yeah.
Oh boy. Okay. Well, thank you again.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. And thank you to everyone.
Thank you for everybody, and thank you for all of the guests you brought as well, Barbara. I hope they enjoyed it.
Time out of your Sunday afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Grazie.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Thank you.
There we go. All right. I was just I was just watching everybody leave, so.
Well, thank you so much for running that so synthetically and efficiently. I appreciate it, Andrea.
Thank you. I'm much better at it than when we first started, that's for sure. We're learning everything. Thank you again. That was a lovely, lovely question and answer, and I hope our guests enjoyed it as much as I did.
Well, it's very what you guys are doing a great thing, and I have to say our Dr. Bob is quite a sweetheart and quite prepared. So he's got a mixture of qualities. So he's quite a resource.
He is, and we will edit this. So take all of the stuff at the beginning and the end. We'll edit this and we'll put it out on our YouTube channel. And when we do that, I'll let you know. And then also, if I'll go through the list of questions, and if you want to send over those resources that you were talking about, I will share those with all the folks.
No, that's a totally fair question, and it's because I was reading about that, as I said, just the other day, thinking, that could be a question. So yeah.
Lots of great ones. Well, thank you again. Have a lovely afternoon.
You too. Go enjoy. Yes, the California spring is nice.
Exactly.
Take care. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you.